it really is a great pleasure to be at Johns Hopkins again. So one thing Sanjeev may remember or not, in 2005, I gave a version of this talk actually as part of the Johns Hopkins Summer Workshop. And it's recorded online, and lots of people have commented about Professor Jenelik actually making comments about that presentation on record. So there is a long history of this particular presentation. Well, I mean, it's quite different. I don't think there's any shared slides anymore between that version and this version from about 17 years ago. So anyway, so you will notice my slides are all bilingual because I kind of got into a habit of trying to promote work on NLP in the Arab world. And I found it important to introduce it for speakers of Arabic, also to kind of give them a bridge into English as they venture into doing research in NLP. So almost all my slides are bilingual. Just ignore the Arabic if you can read it, or let me know what you think of the Arabic if you can read Arabic. So let's see. So I'll say a couple of words about my university, which has a weird name, including two city names in it. It's New York University Abu Dhabi. So New York University, NYU, had famously about 10 or so years ago expanded into a global network. There's 14 campuses, of which we have Shanghai, Abu Dhabi, and New York, which we now call NYU New York. It's true. They don't like it in New York, don't you say that? But that's what we call them. And it's just a collective of these campuses. Students enter in one of the main three, Abu Dhabi, Shanghai, or New York, and then they have easy access to summer courses and semesters abroad through the rest of the campus. So this is just pictures of our campus in Abu Dhabi. We are actually, sadly, cliche, in ivory tower on an island, both actually. Abu Dhabi is a collection of islands, in fact, for people who don't know. Our students come from all over the world. Only about 15% are from the UAE and about 15% Americans. And I've taught classes where 24 students come from 24 countries, and teaching something about language and technologies with NLP. It's amazing when you have such an audience. Very tough. And specifically, you notice this lab, CAMeL lab. The name is actually, there's a pun in the Arabic. The Arabic does not mean the name of the animal. The Arabic actually is the word perfect. It just happens to be this way. I was selected that way. And of course, I got a joke when I went to NYU, oh, you're going to the desert, your research will be buried in the desert sand. Somebody actually used those words. And I said, well, I need a camel then, right, to survive. So that's where the lab started about almost 8 years ago now. We've been very productive, about 120 publications and 20 plus resources. So I made the shift to focusing on Arabic primarily as my focus of research, Arabic NLP. So you can check us out online, and lots of people have helped in this efforts, and I thank them all. So for the talk, to jump into it, I assume everybody knows what NLP is, but so forgive me, I'll do like a very quick view, like a few slides of my sense of what NLP is, because sometimes that may not be, people may not be on the same page. I'll talk about Arabic NLP challenges and some solutions from our lab. And at the end, we'll see how much time I have. I'll do some shameless advertising for EMNLP 2022, which is Empirical Methods for Natural Language Processing, the #2 conference in computational linguistics, which will happen in Abu Dhabi in December this year. So NLP, again, sorry, this is not the right level for this audience. You're familiar with it. It's lots and lots of different contexts, from machine translation to spelling, grammar correction, etc. And as a field, it comes with many different connections to many other fields. As Sanjeev said, I had the luck of realizing very early on in mid-90s that I should actually get a degree, 2 degrees in both. I spent 6 years in my undergraduate, pickled basically, and but then it helped overall. So lots of different applications, and I try to distinguish between applications and enabling technologies, where we talk about components that are useful for other components, may not be themselves the end product, and particularly things like tokenization, which today's age with machine learning and neural models, particular, where everybody thinks of tokenization as chop up into word pieces or BPE, there still has been shown actually some advantage in certain contexts, particularly with low resource languages, that having linguistically kind of inspired techniques for tokenization together with those other techniques actually help, particularly for languages like Arabic, where what you see on the screen is one single word in terms of white space separated tokens, but then linguistically inside of it, it corresponds to many different tokens in English. And so there's something about to be aware, at least, when you are modeling whether this is something worth doing or not, depends on how much data you have, etc. The techniques, of course, that we generally know about is the traditional, right now, dinosaur age, classical, linguistic, rule-based or intuition-based, as some people like to call them, techniques, as opposed to machine learning techniques. Of course, as you know, machine learning is dominating in our field, particularly working with Arabic and dialects and some of the challenges that I'll talk about later. We still find that there is some value for sometimes including intuition as part of, meaning translated into rules, etc., as part of a big system. And the combination of the two seems to create the magic that we need actually to get the best performance. And of course, data is extremely central to all of this kind of work. So I'm going to skip over this because you guys should know all of that. Let me get to what's interesting about Arabic. So, so this is just a kind of a laundry list of specific kind of problems. I'm going to go through all of them one by one. But a lot of them, I assume people know what orthography is, how you refer to how you write. Morphology is the structure of the words. What are the different elements that come into it? And, so we're going to go through all of these different items. But these are mainly the challenges that us people working on Arabic particularly have to deal with. So we start with the basics. So Arabic is written with the Arabic script, which is also used to write many other languages. It's written from right to left, and the letter shapes actually shift depending on the context that they appear in. I colored coded here, just if you cannot read Arabic to kind of see it. This actually used to be a problem. It's not a problem anymore as far as technology is concerned. With Unicode, with very standard algorithms for processing it, it's actually solved. Unfortunately, we still find public displays in Arabic where they actually have not used the right font or right, support, and it breaks the rhythm of the viewer. It's very hard for Arabs to read the separated version. And the little box here, just to kind of give you a sense of how Arabic as a script has this international presence. So the area in the green is what's used in standard Arabic in all of Arabic dialects today. The bigger box is the extended Arabic that's used for other languages like Persian, Urdu, Kurdish, Pashto, and many, many other more. And without knowing anything about the languages, you can tell, okay, this is similar to how, say, German extends the basic Roman script by adding dots on top of things or other symbols. So again, it's a script. People often think Arabic is one thing, and it's really many different things. Persian is actually closer to English in terms of its topology than it is to Arabic, although it's written in Arabic script. Now, so the script is one aspect, of course, and then another aspect is this orthographic ambiguity. And I would say this is probably one of the central problems that we have to deal with. And what it is that Arabic orthography, or the spelling standard that we use for Arabic language, drops the short vowels. If you can see the word that appears here at the top, there's multiple versions of it at the bottom with different, accents sitting on top and below. Those are not required. In fact, in newspapers, we see them about 1.5% of the time. So people never write them. Usually children are introduced to them, and foreigners who are learning Arabic first year, they have to kind of be guided to how to read. But at some point, you stop actually needing this and you just figure it out in context. On average, there are almost 7 different diacritizations in standard Arabic per word out of context, of course, in a Zipfian distribution. So you can make a really solid guess that gets you 90% of the time just by picking one form, quite often, actually. And they correspond to different meanings. Sometimes they're quite varied. You can see in the English here, the same word could mean contract, necklace, psychoses, and also a verb, meaning he stresses us out, right? All connected with each other. If you think this is kind of weird, it's actually, there's something kind of abstractly elegant about it. A contract is something that connects. Psychoses is like a knot in your mental health, and a necklace is made out of little pieces that are connected with each other, right? So in fact, the root is the same root in all of these cases. It's not that different. There are cases that are even weirder, but you have to kind of go into the the logic of the language.
And
Yeah, sure, please. Yeah.
And maybe you'll have to repeat it for the online audience.
Sure.
The first question is, like you kind of alluded to it, but how hard is the restoration task? And you said you can get 90-something%. The second question is, how critical is it for downstream processing once you get to that accuracy?
Yeah. That's a great question. So the question is about how hard is it to actually do the restoration of the diacritic or automatic diacritization, and how important is it to downstream tasks? So for standard Arabic, we've reached numbers that are in the 96% accuracy. The first 90% or 89% you get very quickly, but then it's the harder part is what you get later. And that's in news genre, right? So you go to other genres, it may be a bit harder, right? Because of the training data is different. Now, in terms of its importance for downstream tasks, so results have been shown for tasks like machine translation, for example, to other languages is not that important. So you can live without it, really. People have tried lots and lots of things with very, very minimal gains and sometimes setbacks, actually. But for tasks like speech synthesis, for example, that seems to be like a primary kind of idea where people think of diacritization as a step on the way of phonetization to kind of map into a phonetic representation before you do the next step. But also, I know efforts that were done, for example, in Transtack on Iraqi English speech-to-speech, they actually did not do that step. They just went directly from the undiacritized form into the speech model and did everything jointly. So you can do things jointly, obviously, if you have enough training data for it, right? But for a lot of tasks, it's actually not central. Now, Arabs are obsessed with this task because it's very hard actually, I should clarify. It's because I just said something inconsistent in your perception. I said you learn how to do it. It's easy, and now I just said it's hard. There's actually two types of diacritizations. There's the diacritization that are lexical, that tell you about the meaning of the word, and they're usually at the beginning and the middle of the word. And then there's diacritics that are typically at the end of the word that tell you the case, meaning is it nominative, accusative, or genitive? And both are dropped, right? So some you can figure out with a semantic model that you may have in your head, or BERT type model, but the other type, you actually need long distance relations and dependencies to figure out, is this actually the subject of the verb? Is this a modifier of the word that comes before it? And that second group is actually harder for Arabic speakers because it doesn't exist anymore. And we'll get to know about that when we talk about the dialects. The standard Arabic is just a language that is effectively artificial at this point. It's just a standard that doesn't exist anymore. Yeah. I hope this long answer kind of got it. Okay.
Thank you. That's what I thought.
Right. So one aspect is this issue of ambiguity. You see a word and you don't know what it means, right? And this other aspect is actually quite different. And in the past, people would kind of mix the two together, and it's morphological richness. So this basically is about that there are lots of different forms of a particular concept or a word. So if you think of a dictionary entry of a word, like say in this example, I have the verb to say, قال, there's about 5,400 different forms of it, right? It's like a really large number, right? I mean, if you know any European languages, you never get to that number. You probably get to about 100 or so, perhaps. You have things like gender, number, person, aspect, mood, case. But on top of it also, you have in Arabic, a style of writing conjunctions like the word and, or therefore, or like, or prepositions like in are written attached to the word, right? So you take these extra letters and a pronoun. So like, for his school is one single word written together, right? And now the letter that is the preposition could be interpreted as part of a base word of another word, possibly out of context, right? So that these two complexities kind of, when they come together, they become really problematic. But independently, right? I mean, they are quite hard to model to start with. Compared to English, you have only about 6 forms for verbs. So Arabic is 900 to 1 in that form. So think of a word, say, saying, said, it's says, right? That's about it. You don't have any other forms. And Chinese wins the game. There's only one form in essence that you would have for the verb, and that's easier. Then a third problem is dialectal variation. So when people talk about Arabic again today, we sometimes you have to be specific particularly, you can talk about classical Arabic, which would be the Arabic used in the Quran or the Hadith or historical texts. There's also modern standard Arabic, which is the official language of all Arab countries today, the official language of the Arab League. It's the official language of the media. the default is, you listen to Al Jazeera or some other news channel, it will be in standard Arabic. And this is considered as the national language. And then there's dialectal Arabic, which is primarily spoken varieties. And dialects exist in every language in the world, right? It's not unique as a phenomenon. The problem with Arabic is that the distance, the difference between the standard and the dialect is so large, right? You're talking about a language. The modern standard, for example, its grammar is the same as the grammar of the classical Arabic from 1,400 years ago, right? I mean, very few languages in the world other than Chinese can actually claim that long distance of actually being able to, I can pick a book from 1,000 years ago and read it as if it was written yesterday. Okay, some words will look funny, etc. I may not always be able to predict the case endings that they had picked necessarily, but I can get the very strong gist of the meaning compared to, for example, reading English, Middle English, for example, not pre-Shakespeare, of course, much older, like 1000 AD. It's much harder. So I think that is kind of one of the differences that we have to deal with. And these dialectal variants, I'll give you lots of examples to kind of convince you of why they're different or this difference issue. They have no official standards, so they have not made the political transition. The statement, a language is a dialect with an army, right, and a navy, right? So not a single Arab dialect have made that transition except one, actually, and that's Maltese. So the language of Malta in many different ways is effectively an Arabic dialect. We've actually had Maltese paper presented in our workshops on Arabic NLP at times. So it's very similar to North African Arabic, like in Tunisia, for example, but with a heavier dose of Italian as opposed to French. And they've made the independent step. It's an independent language standards and everything. Other Arabic dialects have not made this transition. Another thing, actually, ironically, from Johns Hopkins summer workshop from 2005, there was a big project. One of the competing projects was on automatic speech recognition for Egyptian Arabic with the call home Egypt data. And at the time, people think, oh, you only need to work on speech recognition. There's nothing else to work on with dialectal Arabic because it's only spoken. 17 years now after, with things like Facebook and forums, people are writing in the dialect. I mean, there's more written text in the dialect than there is in standard Arabic, actually, that you can find. And also of interesting topics for people who want to get a sense of how do people feel about this, that, and the other, etc. So the other thing I want to kind of point out is that these three different forms, they don't live in separate bubbles. They're actually all together, we transition between them. I mean, in my own daily life, I know that just the typical Arab man, we may pray in the classical language in the morning, wake up, you do your prayers in classical Arabic, you go read the newspaper in standard Arabic, and then you tell your husband or wife you love them in the dialect, and you talk to your children in the dialect, right? And the two, you kind of float between them quite naturally, actually. So for somebody who is completely fluent and comfortable, they have to really know how to transition between all of these different forms, right? And this is something that you don't see the same way. The closest in English, if I have to kind of say it, is like someone who's more educated, who can use, Roman-based verbs forms like inquire instead of ask, and they know when to use inquire instead of using the word ask, and use words like etc. and not call it etc. or espresso, not espresso, not espresso. Those little things are the subtleties that we're talking about here. And Arabs make those kind of mistakes also of transition sometimes. It's very hard to do a complete match, obviously. Okay, so now when we talk about these dialects, this is a map of the Arab world that is color-coded against geographical boundaries. And the first thing you'll notice is that they don't match. So it's not like, the boundary of a country matches the boundary of the language, not at all. And in fact, in some cases, you have 3 different groups or 4 different groups coexisting in the same place. But the general grouping that people use to talk about this is about 5 or 6 different categories. So Gulf Arabic, Levantine, Egyptian, Maghrebi, and all of those can also be broken into smaller pieces. And like any natural language with different dialects, you can keep finding differences at every level of provinces and cities. And in fact, in the Arabic NLP community, we've actually had competitions of dialect identification at the city level and dialect identification at the province level. So there are data sets now that exist that did not exist, many, many years ago. So I'll skip the rest of this. I mean, well, one option that is interesting is I get the question often is, are they dialects or are they languages at this point? And I immediately point out that this is a political question, not a technological question in essence. So my attitude now has been to just think of it as it's one Arabic, I have to model all of it. And if I have to figure out with some kind of identification, what is the right context to use certain models or others, I would have to do it. And I say this, I mean, maybe to kind of educate you on an audience that is not an Arab audience, the history of discussing are they dialects or languages goes back to the 1940s, where people were struggling with like independence from colonialism. Are we independent countries with independent identities, or is there a one Arab world? And this conversation is still going. It's actually part of the problems in the Arab world and the Middle East. Yeah, please. Yeah.
Go back to the map for a second. So, when I look at these dialects, if I had to scale these colors by the population,
yes.
I'm looking at the Egyptian, it's this narrow, wispy little thing.
Yes, yes. Thanks to the Nile, right? The Nile is the gift of Egypt, or even the gift to Egypt from the gods, right? So Egypt basically is about a third of the Arab world in terms of population, and it looks like a tiny little appendix there. It's actually the largest groups. And then places like Libya, for example, I don't think they get to even 10 million people total, and it's a huge, the blue area in the middle. Yeah, so absolutely right. I mean, they're not really completely connected to the size. Yeah. All right, so some of the differences that you would actually see dealing with dialects, things like, phonologically, it's the first thing that people notice, that there's certain sounds. So those are, called like, consonantal variables from a sociolinguistic point of view that have many different forms. Like the first one, the ka, for example, could be pronounced in 5. I think actually there's another 6th one that I'm missing here, 6 different ways. So a word like the word for heart could be pronounced qalb, kelb, elb, gelb, ghalb. Right, and there's another pronunciation which wouldn't work in that particular word. That'd be like the sound j, for example. And actually, I have the example down there, actually, right. And then in some cases, you also could have a word like fajr, for example, which could actually mean 2 different things depending on the dialect that you're in. So it's poverty in Egypt, it's dawn in Egypt, but it's poverty in the Gulf. So even with the same pronunciation. But morphologically, I hinted to this a bit earlier. So within the structure of the words, there's been kind of 2 phenomena, a simplification and also a kind of a complexification, if you may. So in some aspect, the case endings that I mentioned, like these are like, think of the Latin declension tables that you may have studied, if you studied Latin. So those Standard Arabic has these, and none of the dialects do. It's just completely gone, simplified. So kind of like what happened in a lot of European languages that lost that phenomena. But at the same time, if you look at the bottom, you see the cases of all of these particles that are getting attached to the word, and clitics, we would call them. So comparable to the English can't, for example, cannot, won't, will not, kind of merging together. So Arabic has tons and tons of these. About 20% of the words have a clitic attached to it. So you end up getting really huge looking words in the dialects that have no comparable equivalent in Standard Arabic as single words. So you have to be, so some things become simpler, some things become actually more complex because of these 2 independent phenomena. And then phonologically, in terms of the, not phonologically, in terms of actually the quality of the sounds themselves that are associated with some morphemes. So you may have a future particle, for example, and it's pronounced in 4 different ways, depending on the dialect that you're in. But oddly, it always appears in the same position, right? So some of these observations we try to exploit when we're trying to model the relationship between one dialect and another, or to use data for one dialect to help with data for another dialect. And then I'll just finish with this kind of funny example here on this. So tomato, think of British versus, so in Arabic, we have about half a dozen or plus of these. This is not everything, actually. So they sound like, tamatam, tamata, benedora, uta, matisha, tomatish, and even the uta could be uta or guta, depending on where you're at, right? So just in terms of written form, there's a whole bunch of these. Right, but also you get things like words like this word, which is pronounced barad, but it could mean either a fridge or a kettle. So something to make things hot or something to make things cold, right? And if you search for a house, a kettle for the house, you get Brad Pitt, because that happens to sound exactly like his name in Arabic. Brad Pitt, right, is when it's written. So IR always gets me his picture when you search for this. Now, independent of all of this, you have issues of also just a high degree of spelling errors. Now, this is something that other languages, English is getting into this more, text normalization, how do you deal with it? So in Arabic, we've been thinking about this for quite some time. And, you know, we've had projects showing about 30% error. Even when the author is intending to write in standard Arabic, they will make about 30% of the words with some mistake of some sort. Now, some of these mistakes can go away when you do simple text normalization. Alifia normalization, for those who know about it, you know, solves a big chunk of these, but then other things remain. And, you know, but when we talk about the dialects, one of the challenges that I had been working on for some time is, you know, there is no standard officially. So can you really say there's a mistake when nobody said what the rule is and people are writing in different ways? So one example, this word, it published as an example, it's we found 27 different spellings of it, right? Again, in a Zipfian distribution, you can pick the first one or two and say normalize to all of it to that form. But this is kind of the degree of variability that you would have to be modeling. And if you're dependent on having, you know, lots of training data, you have to think in clever ways how you're going to be preparing the data, pre-processing it, tokenizing it, etc., to make use of it. And I'm not even talking about Arabizi, which is at the bottom, which is, if you've never heard of the word, it's Arabic Inglisi, English, the word for English. So it's Arabic written in Roman script letters. And this used to be more popular. It's getting less and less popular now that there's better support for this writing and displaying Arabic than used to be, but still is present. Okay, so, and many of these things kind of come together. They're not, you can't just solve one without the other. So you could have words that have, you know, the issue of the spelling together with the lack of diacritics together with the different splits that all kind of combine. So, all right, so I talked about a lot of problems. I should tell you some solutions in the last 20 minutes, all right? So it's not depressing. So I'm gonna be talking about a lot of the projects that are happening in my lab as part of this. And I picked a few things here that I thought would be actually particularly relevant for the JSOLV project on decode switching, because I thought, you know, there may be something interesting there. So some of you may have heard of used Metamira. It's a bit of an older system right now. It was developed in 2014, but it's kind of a solid system that is used for morphological analysis and disambiguation. And it still actually does quite well and has been used by lots of people. It does a combination of using kind of modeling the rich morphology using rule-based techniques, but also using machine learning techniques for predicting the features in context. So we basically combine the information from both sides to find the best result that we would need. And there's a demo online. I'm actually going to be zooming through these, right, just to kind of give you a sense, and I'm happy to stop and answer questions if need be. The systems was, when it was developed, at the time it was developed, was the first to actually also do the transition to modeling, not just standard Arabic, but also Egyptian Arabic. And, you know, in these results here, it's just to kind of give you a sense of how do you evaluate, right? You can look at, how good am I at segmenting the word, identifying what particles actually are part of the word or not, the base word. What about part of speech tagging or lemmatization or the full analysis or the diacritization, right? How well do I do in all of these different contexts? And here, you know, it's extremely important that you have to match the dialect that you're working with. So given the data that we have, which is in the about 600,000 words for the standard Arabic and about 300,000 words for the Egyptian, this is what we were able to get from a few years back. As of this year, actually, in ACL that just happened almost a month ago, we've managed to get much better results using fine-tuning with a BERT model called CAMeL BERT that we developed in the lab that has a mix of standard Arabic, classical Arabic, and dialectal Arabic, and it's quite large. And now we've gotten to results that's quite strong, actually. I mean, we've never imagined to get to 96% accuracy on every aspect of the word. Yes.
So this is like single system?
This is, so these are 4 different systems actually. So each one of them is done for a separate dialect. If I remember the results, when you combine things right now, we're not able to get better results. So there seems to be an interference. And part of the interference seems to be coming from the fact that these data sets, when they were annotated, were annotated to some degree independently, although not completely, and at different times. So there's a lot of work that we're doing now on actually making sure that all of the annotations are consistent and kind of revisited as part of having a stronger models there. And this number in Gulf Arabic is a bit mixed. Just I should say something about it because it's almost as strong as the standard Arabic, but it's 1/3 the size of the data, except that it's done on a version that has no spelling errors. And there was a limitation of the data set that we had where we could not actually test on the raw version of the data because some words were split and merged, etc. But just so this is actually going to be part of a toolkit that we developed at the lab called CAMeL tools, which I'll say a few words about at the end. So it should be available for people to use. The Medamira demo, it's the first time I'm going to say this publicly, will actually be discontinued by the end of the year. So we will not be supporting Medamira anymore, and we're switching completely to the CAMeL tools system that is open source and public, and we're trying to move everything to be just open at this point. Another project, just also to give you a sense of the ideas that we've been working with and playing with, is this Madar project. This was a collaboration with Carnegie Mellon, Qatar University, and Columbia, where we actually did modeling for 25 cities in parallel. So it's the first data set that has parallel test sets, really smallish test sets for 25 cities and for 5 major central cities for different regions. We have about 20,000 sentences. This is based on BTEC, with some people who work on speech and speech translation may be familiar with the basic traveling expressions corpus. So it has also translations into English and French and a few other languages. And this was used as part of doing tasks for like dialect identification. I'll give you a sentence. Can you tell me which one of 25 cities or standard Arabic this comes from, right? It almost, when you try it on something that is outside, you get this really interesting effect of, interpolation of like it finds cities that are around it, but it doesn't know where it is exactly, for instance. And this also came with a lexicon development effort. So here we're just kind of going to the basics of, we don't have data, we need to create data, and we need to create it in a very systematic way so we can actually ask questions about it that then allow us to make statements that are meaningful. And this data set has, I believe, about 47,000 entries, including phonological form. So that could be interesting for people working on speech, possibly, although it is lemmas, not full form words. So I'm just gonna skip this, right? So one interesting observation from one of the demos we have on the tool that gives you the identification. You put a sentence in and it tells you on a map and gives you all the statistics of how likely is this to be from which city. For the task of identifying 1 out of 25 cities or standard Arabic, we get about 68%. This has been very hard to beat. And however, we kind of made this through a controlled setting. This is almost an oracle experiment, effectively. You could, well, semi-oracular. If you add a few words from the same dialect, but without revealing the dialect. So from this, you kind of just think that you're talking to someone a bit longer, effectively, and you just get more words out of them. By the time you get to about 16 words, you can get to 90% accuracy using the same kind of model. It's the same effect as, just listening to someone, the longer you listen to them, the more likely you'll be able to guess which dialect they come from, maybe because they said particular keywords, right? So this kind of was replicated, at least in a controlled experiments with this data. Yeah, please, yeah.
So we were to do dialect ID for audio. Something like 7 words, it's pretty hard to do. I don't know if Paula has a comment, but it's like less than 3 seconds of data. That's pretty hard. 16 words, you're getting to not much more, you're getting to 25, 6 seconds.
Interesting.
And it's starting to have some effect. And I think we need to go up to a good 10, 15 seconds.
So I know there was a dissertation at Columbia from 2011 or 10 with Fadi Bayatsi, who's now at Google, who did actually automatic dialect identification from audio. But he did it at the time over regional dialects, right? So this is kind of harder also because, there's data points that are so close to each other that's really, it's implausible that you could actually ever figure it out. I mean, it's just there happen to be some cities like in Tunisia, Tunis and Fas, Tunis and Sfax were very close to each other, and they made it into our cut, and it was maybe, you know, it was the edge case basically for us. Yeah. Just quick comments. You know, there's been an effort of a system called, or effort on a project called CODA, Conventional Orthography for Dialectal Arabic, where our goal was to basically come up with conventions that can be used within our tools to basically systematize how we represent the dialectal writing. And now, this can allow us then to do things like automatic spelling and grammar correction on Arabic dialects, which we could not do because officially there's no standard, but also to kind of get different efforts kind of coordinated in terms of how they refer to these word forms. Another project that is a little bit different, but I thought, you know, last night that after I got the request yesterday to give the talk, so just you kind of know, I thought, okay, you know, this could be interesting. So we have a project on text simplification happening in NYU Abu Dhabi with a collaboration with folks in the Arabic program, and as part of this effort, we've actually built a lexicon, or I should say, we annotated the lexical components of our tools with readability level on 5 levels of readability, where first level is what do we expect children at age 6 and 7 to know, versus 8, 9, 10, versus 11, 12, etc. Right? So this is kind of like how fancy is your vocabulary, effectively, into 5 different levels. And this is connected with the Arabic WordNet in an interface that is also connected with morphological disambiguation. So you give it a word, it will figure out which possible lemmas it comes from. For each one of these, it will tell you the readability level, will give you a link to other roots connected to it and other words connected to it and other synonyms connected to it. And the reason I thought this could be actually interesting in the context of the code switching is, could it be a dimension to exploit for, you know, is it that someone would actually prefer to switch to another language to avoid, to use a word that they may know that is simpler for them than the word that they're not thinking of, or the word that they want that is a harder word, right? So it's an interesting intuition. I'm not really sure how would we actually test it exactly with data that we have, but I thought, you know, this is a resource. It's 40,000 forms that have been annotated for this. Of course, this is on standard Arabic, right? So, you know, another twist in another constraints here. Another project which also was inspired by some of the conversations from yesterday. I mean, we've been working on this for about 3 years now, is on gender bias in Arabic. So the lab is busy. I have about 7 full-time people working in it, 2 for them PhD students, and we typically have about 8 undergraduate students in the lab. So this is kind of, and it's all actually funded mostly by NYU Abu Dhabi or projects that we get funding from locally. So this particular project is on gender bias, where we look at gender identification and gender reinflection or rewriting. So think of the problem of machine translation, English, like, you know, so I'm a doctor, I'm a nurse, you can't tell the gender, but in Arabic you can, like many other languages, of course. And here it's male doctor and female nurse always, you know, which is good for some people, not for other people. So part of what we have done on this project is, again, set up the scientific experiment properly, we collected data, annotated the data for gender, and then created parallel versions. So I think, as far as I know, we were the first to actually do a parallel gender corpus, where you have the same sentence, something like, you know, I am leaving or I am rich in both versions. If I was a man or I was a woman, how would it look like, right? And then this data, we've actually added to it first person and second person. So if I'm talking to someone, I'm like, you know, I miss you, darling, you know, you get all the different combination of men, women on either side, or male, female, gender agreement. So I don't want to confuse the 2 meanings of gender in this case. I'm talking about grammatical gender specifically. And, you know, from this, we were able to kind of identify, for example, the degree of bias Google has, which was about 10-to-1 preference of male to female. There were cases where it actually always generated the feminine, like I am divorced is feminine and I am stressed is feminine, right? But other things are not feminine. So it's kind of like, you know, you can see here the problem with bias in this setup. We have a paper about a system that we developed that is using neural modeling and for improving both the gender identification and gender rewriting, and it will be presented next week in NACL. So those of you who are going to be to NACL, say hi to us. And the task is quite hard, and we're getting about 88% F score on this task. So there's still a lot more to work on. This is just kind of also part of a general trend, by the way. Twitter introduced feminine form for the interface for in Arabic. So women tweeting could actually have all of the messages from Twitter to them in the feminine agreement form instead of the the default masculine that's often used. I'm going to skip these things and just go to just a couple of things, I guess. So we have a toolkit. I mentioned it earlier, this CAMeL tools. It's an open source Python toolkit. Go to GitHub, check it out. We've been quite popular, actually, and I've basically made the decision since I've gone to NYU to just get everything basically moved into the one common space to just kind of build the momentum of all of the connections of the different tools we're developing. And so I'm just weary of the time here. I don't want to keep people too long. And then one last thing I just should say, we do have a BERT model like everybody else and their mother, right? It's called CAMeL BERT, not to be confused with Camembert, which apparently, by the way, there is something called CAMELBEAR. It's cheese made out of camel milk. So it's popular in the Gulf, but I've never tasted it. Just to me, it's a little bit hard to imagine that. Anyway, there is some work that's done on this. I just want to kind of point out, because some people had not known about it from conversation from the last couple of days. What's kind of unique about this particular resource is that we designed it with this idea of the difference of the different variety of Arabic, we wanted to control for it. So we have different versions of it that are only in standard Arabic, only in classical Arabic, and only in dialectal Arabic, and mixed together. And we did extensive comparison against common BERT models for Arabic, and on about 12 different tasks, from named entity recognition all the way to things like poetry type. So in Arabic, there are these different classes of poetic styles, and can you identify the poetic style of a poem, for example? Interestingly, classical Arabic BERT, having a relatively tiny amount of data compared to the standard Arabic, does well on that task. Kind of makes sense to some degree, but other tasks, standard Arabic generally seems to be the winner, simply because of size, I would imagine. And on some tasks that involve dialects, having the mix where you have standard Arabic and dialectal Arabic data mixed together seems to give us the biggest advantage. As those of you who work with BERT type models or have developed them, it's really hard to try to make sense out of the behavior. And what we're trying to do here is just to control for some variables to try to see if we can see some patterns. We did not do probing exactly here, but this is available for people who are interested in that kind of work. All right, so I'm going to summarize, unless you have a question.
I was going to say that clock is 5 minutes past, so you might want to take it a little bit. I was wondering why you were rushing it.
Okay, sorry. I'm looking at the clock and I'm thinking, okay, and then we started a bit late too, so I'm sorry about that. Yeah, but there's more I can share still. So, for those of you who have never looked at Arabic or Arabic NLP, I hope I give you a sense of the kind of problems that we deal with working with Arabic. And if there is a lot of work that has happened over the last 20 or so years, and there's still a lot more work that's happening on it. There's actually kind of a resurgence historically happening in the Arab world, where there is lots of new universities focusing on dealing with NLP and AI in general, actually. So there's a lot of interesting possibilities there to take ideas that you may have working with other languages and try them with our data sets. If you cannot read Arabic script, it's not a problem. There's actually standard transliteration tools that are one-to-one that you can work with it with Roman script space, and many people have done this in the past without a problem. If you're interested in Arabic NLP community, there is also, we just formed a special interest group as part of ACL. So now there's SIG Arab as of January this year. And so, join us if you want to just listen in on what people are working on. And that's it. I thank you. And then I can open for question, or I can give you my little spiel about EMNLP 2022, but maybe,
That's a good question.
Yes.
Questions or comments?
So will you try to translate one network or some other?
That's a great question. So the question was, are you trying to translate from the dialects to standard Arabic, or have you looked at translating from the dialect to standard Arabic? No.
Your slides.
Oh, sorry, my slides. I couldn't hear it because of the mask. Slide is standard Arabic, yeah, which is the appropriate level for the context in this case. Yeah.
Other questions?
Do you find that this work is or if there's anything looking at how extrapolatable this is to dialectal variations in other languages? Because the first thing that comes to my mind, for at least in America, is studying dialectal variation with African American vernacular English in general.
Right. That's a great question. So, so I know there's some growing effort. Oh yeah. So sorry. The question was about how much of these ideas are extrapolatable to other languages with dialectal variants, and specifically the gentleman was thinking of the African American vernacular, English vernacular compared to standard English. So I know there is kind of growing interest in working on AAV, and that's great to see. I actually remember talking with some gentlemen in ACL 2019 about this. I'm pointing out to some of the resources that we have. It's yet to be seen, in fact, right? I think some aspects of the work will be relevant, but maybe others would be not as relevant, just simply because, you know, the whole context of Ebonics, for example, right? And, you know, there's basically this idea that you want to teach English, teachers in teaching African-American communities should actually learn African-American vernacular enough to be able to help their students learn standard English without making them feel that they are speaking an inferior version of English. So socially, it's a very different setup. I mean, I've actually used it the other way around. That particular experience I've actually used with Arab colleagues to talk about how we should teach standard Arabic by making the teachers aware of the dialects and its standards, you know. But in the other direction, I'm not aware actually of any specific efforts, but I would imagine some things could carry. Yeah. So sorry, I'm not giving you any specific answer that I know of, but I agree with the intuition. Yeah.
Yeah, I was just wondering, like, the dialect standardization of dialects, how these things are going on. Because the more we build tools to generate dialect,
Yeah.
reinforcing that.
Yeah. No, yeah. So the question from Philip was about, am I aware of any effort on standardization of the dialects? And I guess a second part of it is that now that we're developing tools that will be automatically doing text generation, we're reinforcing certain phenomena. And you're absolutely right. So as far as official efforts on standardization of the dialect, I think it's moving very slowly. It's not there yet. So the UAE, United Arab Emirates, I think 2 years ago made kind of this official statements of its policy on Arabic. And for the first time, it actually was surprising. They actually referred to Arabic and all of its dialects as, you know, important variants in a special relation. They use really flowery language to basically say, we're not going to be discriminating against dialects, but, you know, and we need to make them, you know, understand them as part of our cultural heritage, right? So it is a tough topic still for some people. Now in practice, there was actually a very important kind of point, I think in December of 2021, there was a release of Alexa Arabic. I mean, there was different versions of Alexa Arabic, but there was a release of Alexa Arabic that was unique. It was primarily in Gulf Arabic. And it just kind of made it like our customer base is Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, it's Gulf Arabic. And you know, so it was really interesting to kind of see them make that transition at that point. And now you see her, you know, on TV ads, sometimes people talking to Alexa and she's talking back to them. So I think we're building the culture of basically realizing that this is not dangerous. You're not destroying Arab identity. In fact, this is an embrace of it. And this is the part that bothers people psychologically sometimes, or at least some people in power positions. So I think that is slowly going in that direction. The beautiful thing about Alexa Arabic, I really like the work that team did. So she has a very cool kind of Gulf Arabic woman voice. And then she speaks in Gulf Arabic, you know, in the formal style, you know, which is, you know, not to say it's not standard, but it's kind of a bit more formal. So it's very kind of respectable. And then when you ask her a question from Wikipedia, for example, that she picks an answer for, like, who is Najib Mahfouz, she reads it in standard Arabic for you with the same voice, right? And then when you ask something in English, she answers in English with a Gulf accent, which I thought was just this consistency was so charming that, like, this is really beautiful, you know, NLP technology that happened there. I think this is going in that direction. To finish the last part of, I was at the Arab Summit, which happened in Dubai in 2021. And there was actually a big discussion about this concept of one Arabic as basically, let's not talk about these differences as if they are sitting separately, but rather one form of language, and we need to deal with all of it together. And they even include different dialects in that one Arabic concept. So I think we're going there. I think part of me, I'm hoping that the work on CODA, which had started almost 10 years ago, will actually be kind of ready for, it's ready to use, right? I know that there are websites that already start using CODA. So there was a website on Palestinian Arabic to teach Palestinian Arabic, which I don't know I'm Palestinian, those who know, but I did not know those people, but I was really surprised they referred to one of our publications and said, we cannot find a standard. We found these people, we like their standard, we're gonna use their standard. And I'm like, okay, you know, so I think it's going there slowly. Yeah, it's a little bit different kind of the role that we take in this context is, you know, linguists and computational linguists and computer scientists, and you have to kind of manage, I have to talk sometimes to, I sit on a committee advising the Minister of Culture, for example, in the UAE, where I have to talk about, you know, challenges for how to teach computer science, but also how to talk about Arabic, right? So it's a role that is kind of a bit more complex than what we were trained for. Yes.
What do you think is the correct way to store machine-generated sentences?
Yeah, so the question was, what is the best way or a good way or correct way to score machine or text-generated Arabic? Depends what the target is that you're talking about. So one of the efforts in the JSOLV project that I'm part of here is actually on automatic evaluation of speech recognition, generated text that is code switched between Arabic and English, which is a very unique kind of context, I would say. I would say in other cases, we'd have to look at, you know, the, you know, consistency in the, say, the dialect or genre that you're looking at, you know, should be one aspect. I've done some work in the past with a system that we still have the tools for called EMNLP, which actually tries to give you a score like on top of blue that would say, you know, we're going to match words based on their lemmas. You know, did you capture the core meaning appropriately? Should we give you some partial credit for that or not? So I think there's probably a space of things to explore there. But if you give me maybe a bit more of what is the context specifically you're thinking of, I may be able to give a better answer for you. Okay, so in the case of machine translation, you know, people use blue. There's a couple of variants on blue that are like, there's an L blue for Arabic that was developed a while back. And also, as I mentioned, this Amina version that gives you the lemma-based evaluation. I'm not aware of any particular metrics that are specific to Arabic beyond that. Typically, we don't tokenize. So I have a paper with Ahmed Al-Khouli from a few years back on translation into Arabic, where we made an argument that, you know, although you could, let's say, do a lot of heavy normalization on some letters when you learn the model, but at the end you have to do the equivalent in Arabic of, you know, true casing. So Arabic doesn't have case. There's no capital and small letter, but there's other phenomena that we think are as important. So ideally, I would say you should report on the full form of the word, not tokenized, and, you know, so it's the harshest level. Now, all these other versions you can report on, right? Obviously, if you want, but I think they would be for contrastive reasons, right? To say like this model and that model, you know, when I tokenize them automatically, this model does a bit better, even though the other one does better in other contexts. I mean, but that's really if you're trying to make a particular point, I would say. But a great question, because it means like you're aware now of the challenges, particularly, right, with the model.
There's a question online.
Oh.
Arun, ask him to speak up.
Okay, Arun, can you speak up?
Oh,
please?
yeah. So basically, I like the idea of the doing this one-one correspondence that you have basically where you're trying to like map it with all possibilities, right? So I just was interested to know like how you were gonna like, what kind of research questions can actually come out of that? Like as in, can we analyze the factors in a way and then, you know, build a model for that, making it culturally sensitive and things like that. That's kind of. So yeah, I can repeat my question again. So what I was just saying is that, okay, it's a very good, fantastic idea of like trying to like remap English to certain gender, right? Like and trying to rewrite them with all the different possibilities in Arabic. So my question is that what are some potential research questions that actually can crop out of it?
Yeah, excellent. Okay, so specifically your question about the machine translation with the gender bias case, right? So the question here, I think kind of, when we started thinking of this problem, you know, the student who actually inspired this started as a capstone project, a senior project for a student, and now a PhD student had picked it up. Started with the statement, Google hates women. And I'm like, what? And she's like, yes, you know, Google Translate is always mistranslating my gender, blah, blah, blah. And I said, Google doesn't even know what you want. Right? You know, even though they have access to a lot of your information, that particular MT system does not have any information, no input from you that says what is the gender that you want. So I think to kind of try to answer your question, we thought of, I mean, the default way that people use machine translation system is as a single output model, right? And yes, you can always look at multiple outputs, but at some point you'll be overwhelmed by the number of different combinations. If there's many different actors in the sentence and all of them could have different genders, you're going to get a lot of combinations, and that may not be really feasible. Or if you're traveling on the streets of Tokyo or Abu Dhabi, and then you say something in English and gets translated, you want an output right now, you know, with a specific result. You don't want to look through a list of options and select from them. So what we were thinking of here is like, how do we actually model the user? In fact, the paper in NACL is about user-centered gender rewriting is the title. And so the question for us is, how do we actually provide that information into the system? There are many different ways that we look at in the paper for how to pass on that information to model properly. And the task itself, Aaron, is broken into smaller pieces of, can I identify the gender in the words themselves that are what I have already, and then decide whether there's nothing to do or I need to actually do some modification in context. You can think of this as a machine translation problem in a way, right? Going from one gender to the other gender, but sometimes the output that you get from, you know, machine translation is actually inconsistent. I mean, I have a longer talk about this that's online, where the Google system is completely inconsistent. Even with a long sentence, for example, the gender will switch between the beginning and the end for the same speaker, for instance, and certain biases are just very evident in this. So the idea for us, you know, the research questions we looked at is, you know, what are the different techniques that we can use to, you know, improve the identification of the gender? Can we use morphological resources, linguistic resources to help with this task? Because even with 80,000 sentences, that is not a lot of data, and it's not naturally occurring data that we can use the same way that you have millions of sentences, let's say, for some language pairs. And it's about just allowing the user to have control in the choice that they want to look at. I hope this answered the question.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so any last question from the audience?
So the whole paper is the spoken language with respect to this script.
Right. Yeah, so that's a good question. But it's not the right way to ask the question. Forgive me to say it this way, because if you think of the two varieties of Arabic, the standard and the dialect, let's say Egyptian versus standard Arabic, you know, both of them have their own phonological space, and both of them can be written, right? Now, the fact that there is no official writing standard by the Arab Academy for Egyptian doesn't stop millions of Egyptians of writing comments using Arabic script. They can also write Arabic in their dialect using Roman script. In fact, among Palestinians who are Israeli citizens, you can also see it written in Hebrew script. I mean, so you can see a lot of different varieties, right? Of the script itself is another story altogether, right? So I would say in terms of phonology, there's a bigger difference, particularly of the quality of certain consonants and vowels, but also lexically. I mean, some words are just very different words. You just would never say that word in the dialect, or you would never say that word in the standard. So those differences do exist to start with. When you write, some of these differences will remain because you could never write the word shubak and nafida. It doesn't matter what they mean. They mean window, but you could never write them in one way, right? And in any case, using Arabic script that is also, using some phonological references. So they will always look different. However, if the difference is just in the short vowels, like take the verb, yaktubu and yiktib, right? So you can hear, I mean, there's some parts that are the same. This K, T, and B is the same. Yaktubu, yiktib, right? But those, when they're written, they end up looking the same in that case. So some things, if the difference is simple short vowel differences only, the writing system will hide that difference. But otherwise, there's no way to hide it. I hope this kind of answers it.
All right. So we are, I think, at a point where we should probably break.
Yeah.
Before I close, let me make a quick housekeeping announcement. The lunch is here, so everybody here, please take a break, have lunch. We'll resume at 1 p.m. And when we do that, we will basically have updates from the teams. So with that, let me turn around. Oh yeah. So let me hand the first. Let's thank Nizar for a very nice talk. And then the preview of the next conference.
I'll keep this at 5 minutes, I promise, not more.
Cool.
Okay.
Thank
So I happen to also be the local organizer for Empirical Methods for Natural Language Processing, or EMNLP 2022 in Abu Dhabi. So just a little bit of advertising about Abu Dhabi, because a lot of people seem to think the word Abu Dhabi sounds scary because it reminds them of Abu Ghraib. Of course, Americans were responsible for that, and it's in Iraq, another place. Abu Dhabi actually literally means father of gazelles, because the island that Abu Dhabi is on, which was empty actually for a long time, was a natural habitat for gazelles. And now we see less and less of them because, we see less and less of them because it's this big city with huge towers and whatnot, But so just a few things about the logo for the conference. Actually, if you recognize the ACL logo, this part here. There. So this was kind of an Arabesque style form that we tried to make to kind of recognize the connection to the place. And this is what the city looks like today. No more little gazelles floating around, although actually on the island where I live, we have them sometimes. And one time, one of them ran into my car. It was okay. The car was okay. I kind of took me a couple of hours to recover. Just thought like the poor thing died, but it was fine. It was just stood up and started running. So the conference will be in December when the weather is just amazing in Abu Dhabi. So about 26 centigrade, so it's just really lovely to visit when everywhere, in the north, it's all kind of snow at that point. General Chair is Noah Smith, and with Yoav Goldberg and Zornistek Reva and Yuri Chang are our program chairs. This is actually a picture of the Grand Mosque, in which we will have a view of during the gala dinner. So we'll be in a big, lawn with a view of the mosque in the distance. This is the Louvre Museum, not the one in Paris, its sister in Abu Dhabi, which apparently the beams, the number of beams, the myth goes, is equal to the number of beams that is in the Eiffel Tower. But they kind of flattened it and made it into a dome to kind of reflect on this. It's an incredibly beautiful space. If you ever visit, check it out. People think of the Middle East and places like Abu Dhabi as basically a big desert. We do have access to a very beautiful desert space, but we also are islands, and we have mangroves that are just incredible to walk through. During, December is actually very nice to kind of take a stroll in them. So I'll show my little video. I'll stop at this to not keep you away from your lunch. Thank you very much.